In this passage, Mark continues to highlight Jesus' unique authority by reinforcing the idea that Jesus really is the Son of God. So we saw this in last week's passage where Mark showed us the episode of the healing of the paralyzed man and how even Jesus had authority to forgive sins. And in this passage, Jesus' special authority is revealed in several ways. First, in this episode about the Sabbath, where he's questioned about the teaching on the Sabbath, and then he heals a man on the Sabbath. And then also as he, again, casts out demons and heals many sick people. And then finally, as his authority is demonstrated as he sends forth his apostles with his authority to preach and to cast out demons as well. So our first two questions for discussion in this passage are going to center around this episode concerning the Sabbath. So the first question is this: in what ways do the religious people sometimes demonstrate the same hardness of heart that the Pharisees had that grieved Jesus in this passage? And do you sometimes find this same hardness in your own heart? If so, why? So concerning the Sabbath, there's several important things I think are important for us to see as we look at this teaching on the Sabbath. First of all, it's clear from the Old Testament that Jesus' disciples weren't actually violating the law. In fact, there was a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, that specifically permitted people to pluck heads of grain as they were passing through a neighbor's field. So first of all, the disciples weren't actually violating the law as the Pharisees were claiming they were. The other important thing in Jesus' response to the Pharisees is that he points out another passage. This passage comes from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 41, where David and his companions, they go to the tabernacle and they eat some of the consecrated bread that was only to be for the priests. And so Jesus gives this as an example of a situation where an exception to the requirement of the law was actually made to benefit the people. And so in this situation, David and his men were kind of on the run from Saul, and God had a greater purpose in sustaining David and his men that was over and above his purpose for the consecrated bread at the tabernacle. So Jesus gives this as an example of where following the letter of the law might actually end up working against the overall purpose of the law. So it seems like Jesus' point is similar with the Sabbath. He makes the point that the Sabbath was given for man, and that it was to benefit God's people. So the other thing I think we need to notice about this episode concerning the Sabbath is how Mark calls attention to the Pharisees' hardness of heart and how much this grieves Jesus. So immediately after this teaching about the Sabbath, where Jesus proclaims himself as the Lord of the Sabbath, he gives an episode of a man, where Jesus was teaching, and a man was there with a withered hand. And in this episode, I think Mark is showing the utter hardness and callousness of the Pharisees' heart, where they would rather catch Jesus in doing something that was kind of outside their box and therefore accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. They would rather do that than see a man with his hand to be restored. And as I was thinking about this passage, some of you know that my oldest son, Caleb, has sort of a withered hand. He was born without a left hand. And so I was trying to imagine my own son standing before Jesus and these men, and having these men not really care about whether my son was healed, but they were only looking for an opportunity to make an accusation. And so I can kind of begin to feel, I think, some of the anger that was in Jesus' heart as he looked upon these Pharisees that were so concerned with their religious tradition that they couldn't even see the need for this man that was standing right before them. And thankfully, Jesus goes ahead and heals the man, again showing that his authority is greater than even their traditions. So the second question is related again to this episode on the Sabbath. And so it's just asking, do you have a regular time of rest built into your schedule? And if so, describe how this works for you. And if not, what changes do you need to make in order to make this happen? So remember that Jesus' overall point about teaching on the Sabbath is that it was given for the benefit of God's people. And specifically, we would say several things about the Sabbath in terms of its purpose. First of all, it gives us a period of rest and refreshment that we all need. Human beings weren't designed to run 24/7 and 365 days a year. God has designed us so that we need some downtime and some rest. Second, the Sabbath anticipates this coming rest when Jesus returns. The Sabbath rest of the people of God, the author of Hebrews refers to it. And so this gives us hope, looking forward to that ultimate rest that we'll encounter when Jesus comes. Third, it shows compassion to those who work for us so that they too have an opportunity to have a rest. And so if we have a day off where we don't do work, it's a way of showing love and compassion towards those that are working for us. And finally, it demonstrates our trust in God by showing that ultimately our trust is not in what we can gain by our own labors, but really what God is providing for us. And so there are several of those kind of overarching purposes that we see for the Sabbath. So we want to encourage people to have a time of rest, but not to slavishly obey a certain legalistic standard of what the Sabbath ought to be, and thereby make the same mistake that the Pharisees made. The last question is this: does the fact that Jesus is with you give you confidence when you share the good news with others? Why or why not? And this comes from the last episode where Jesus sends out his disciples, his apostles actually, and he gives them his authority to cast out demons and to preach and to go forward and to preach the message of the good news. So Jesus sent out his apostles with this special authority. And we see this consistently throughout the Gospels, really. Jesus echoes that refrain again and again, I am with you. And we see this in the Great Commission at the end of Matthew. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, so therefore go and make disciples of all the nations. So we need to recognize that Jesus is the one who has that ultimate authority, and he has given us the ability to go forward in his authority. But we need to remember that the authority doesn't actually dwell in us. It is a delegated authority that comes from Jesus. So it's not to be something that we wield however we want as some sort of magical power, but it is a real authority that we go forward in Jesus' name. So when we do that, we can have confidence as we go forward in sharing the gospel and in carrying out God's purpose for the church.